We're in the parking lot of the South Texas Family Residential Center, a family detention center for women and children. It's privately run, but it is where Immigration and Customs Enforcement brings women and children when this is where they await their immigration hearings in the future. However, as well as certainly the media tour, where we'll for the first time be allowed to bring in a camera, we won't be allowed to talk to the residents, but they will have the acting ICE director here, no doubt answering some pretty tough questions about this new rule that would allow the families to be held here indefinitely instead of that 20-day limit for children that was mandated by the courts about 20 years ago. We'll be telling you what we saw and what ICE had to say, as well as what an immigration attorney thinks of all this, later on KSAT 12 News, online and on air. In Dilley, Jesse Degollado, KSAT 12 News.
Tomorrow, the Trump administration will publish a new set of rules ending a long-time legal agreement stipulating how long immigrant children can be held in custody. Many expect an injunction and a lawsuit to follow.
One of the people expecting legal action is a top Trump administration official. He was in Austin today, and KXAN's political reporter Phil Prazen asked him about the changes.
Ken Cuccinelli is the acting director of Citizenship and Immigration Services. He spoke to the conservative think tank, the Texas Public Policy Foundation, Thursday morning about going back on the Flores Agreement. That's an agreement that only allowed the government to detain children with families for 20 days. Cuccinelli told me he did not know how many more people this would keep in detention.
That's going to unfold over time going forward, but like I said, there is space immediately now to use.
After a summer's worth of headlines describing cramped conditions and dangerous health hazards, he told me if Congress continues to fund the program, that won't happen again.
There's almost no children held past the 72-hour target any longer in these facilities, as the congressman said, that were not designed for this. So if they will take our advice on just the basics needed to handle the flow we're facing, I promise the same thing will happen at the adult level.
But some, like immigration attorney Griselda Ponce, are skeptical. The new rule will allow a child to be held until their immigration case is finished.
An asylum case generally goes for about 6 months to 9 months. If there's an appeal, it could go for an entire year to 2 years.
She's simply worried for the long-term health and well-being of her clients.
They can call it a residential facility, but when you go into these facilities, they're actually jail-like.
Ponce expects the California judge over the Flores Agreement to place an injunction over this latest change. Phil Prazen, KXAN News.
Part of the Flores Agreement requires states to license immigration detention facilities, but Director Cuccinelli told KXAN because of how broad the agreement was, the state of Texas never reached a conclusion over how to license the facilities.
Federal arrests of non-citizens is on the rise. The U.S. Justice Department says 64% of all federal arrests last year were non-citizens. Most of those arrests are for illegal entry or re-entry.
For more in-depth perspective on what's going on along the southern border, check out borderreport.com. It's a partnership with our sister stations from Brownsville to El Paso to San Diego. You'll find stories from across the region with perspective from those who live and work along the border.
Charlotte has once again found itself in the middle of a new immigration debate. This case has a lot of layers, and it involves this man. He was in federal court today for cutting off his ankle monitor, and he's also facing child charges. But now we're also tracing his case all the way to the border and a debate over detention centers and children. Channel 9's Tina Terry starts our coverage off tonight. And Tina, this all starts with the loophole that seems to have let this man into the country.
Oh yes, Oscar Leonardo Pacheco is in a Charlotte jail tonight, but his voyage to the United States started all the way back in 2016. That is when ICE officials tell us that he entered the U.S. with a child and then cut off an ankle monitor designed to help the government keep track of him. ICE says the U.S. deported Oscar Pacheco back to his home of Honduras in July of 2006. 10 years later, in 2016, they say he came back, this time with the child. And they say because of the child, he was allowed to enter the country, but was assigned an ankle monitor similar to this, a monitor federal prosecutors say he cut off that same year and was on the loose. It's unclear why Pacheco came with the child or if the child belonged to him.
No child should be a pawn in a scheme to manipulate our immigration system.
This week, Acting Homeland Security Secretary Kevin McAleenan said immigrants bringing children to the border intentionally hoping to get in is fueling the crisis at the border.
Human smugglers advertise, and intending migrants know well that even if they cross the border illegally, arriving at our border with a child has meant that they will be released into the United States to wait for court proceedings that could take 5 years or more.
Last week, we told you CMPD arrested Pacheco and charged him with crimes against a child. He made bond and left Mecklenburg County's jail despite an ICE request asking the sheriff to hold him. ICE found and arrested him nearly 2 months later, but as ICE looked into deporting him, federal documents say he was indicted by the U.S. attorney, accused of cutting that ankle monitor and violating supervised release.
And today, prosecutors in the courtroom argue that Pacheco should remain in jail without bond because of that ICE detainer that is currently out on him. The judge and those who were defending him agreed with that, and he will remain in jail here in Charlotte until his next court hearing. Back to you.
All right, Tina, thank you. Pacheco's hearing comes 2 days after the federal government lifted a cap on how long ICE could detain children and their families. The rule was after 20 days, families had to be let go. Homeland Security says that made the problem of people using little kids to force their way into the country much worse. Now ICE can hold those families as long as it takes to get them through the hearings.
Of a falsehood.
Mecklenburg County Sheriff Gary McFadden ran for office promising to torch the federal 287G program in which deputies determine the immigration status of inmates. For that, he's been called out by Dan Bishop's campaign for Congress. A petition telling him to resign is even on Bishop's website. City Councilman Ed Driggs supports the legislature and disagrees with Governor Cooper's veto.
I do think that we need to err on the side of caution when it comes to the possibility of releasing violent criminals, as has happened.
And ICE has repeatedly called out the sheriff, blaming his policy for releasing men like Oscar Leonardo, accused of sexually assaulting a child, and Luis Pineda Archeda, a dangerous domestic violence suspect who was released from the Mecklenburg County Jail twice, despite an ICE request to hold him. Those very public cases led the legislature to step in and try and force the sheriff's hand. Well, there have been a number of studies about just how dangerous the people are that ICE has arrested. Now, the Pew Research Group says the most common crime is drunk driving, followed by immigration violations. And the most violent offenders, those wanted for murder, rape, and robbery, only comprise about 1% of the total. Back to you.
All right, Glenn. Thank you. We can tell you that one of the authors of that bill said that overriding the veto will take bipartisan support. And some are paying key attention to some Democrats from Mecklenburg County. Representative Wesley Harris from District 105 and Representative Christy Clark from District 98.
On Wednesday, the Trump administration announced plans to scrap a court agreement that limited the amount of time migrant children can be detained. For some background, in 1985, a class action lawsuit challenged immigration policies related to detaining juveniles. The suit led to what's known as the Flores Agreement. It requires minors be housed in facilities that meet certain standards and that they're housed in the least restrictive setting appropriate for their age. It also established a state licensing authority over detention facilities and set limits for detaining children. Under current rules, children and families with children detained at the border need to be released within a 20-day window. Republicans have often alleged that the agreement encourages migrants to cross the border with children because they know they'll be released.
So word is out on the street in Central America that if you bring a minor child with you, your chance of being deported goes to almost zero. Your hearing date is years away, and we release you inside the country.
The U.S. Department of Homeland Security argued that the change is meant to close that alleged loophole. It says it'll keep the gist of the Flores Agreement, but eliminate the 20-day limit and create a new licensing system.
By eliminating the incentive to make the journey to the United States as a family, the new rule will reduce the unprecedented volume of family units that has strained the already limited resources of our department components and put children throughout the region at risk.
The rule is set to take effect in 2 months, but it's expected to be challenged in court. An Amnesty International researcher called the new regulations cruel, saying it's beyond logic and humanity to attempt to keep children locked up for as long as possible, especially when we know that this subjects them to trauma and extreme distress. A legal challenge would put the rules in front of a judge who denied a similar request to extend family detention last year.
The Trump administration is rolling out a new plan designed to discourage migrant families from coming to the United States. The new regulations would effectively end the 1997 Flores Agreement, which requires the government to release detained migrant families within 20 days. Under the new plan, migrant families would stay together but would be held indefinitely while the judges consider their asylum requests.
By eliminating the incentive to make the journey to the United States as a family, the new rule will reduce the unprecedented volume of family units that has strained the already limited resources of our department components and put children throughout the region at risk.
The Trump administration says the Flores Agreement is outdated and says the changes are necessary. The new rule is set to take effect in 60 days, and they're expected to face immediate court challenges.
The Trump administration announced a new rule to allow the government to indefinitely keep migrant children in government custody.
I'm the one that kept the families together. With what we're doing now, we'll do even more of that.
Court records show the Trump administration separated thousands of migrant children from their parents and in some cases lost track of them. The latest rule change attempts to erase a previous court settlement that says kids can only be held in custody for 20 days. Acting DHS Secretary Kevin McAleenan says the change will make it easier to deport families who don't qualify for asylum, but also improves the conditions while they're in custody.
They are campus-like settings with appropriate medical, educational, recreational, dining, and private housing facilities.
The acting Secretary of Homeland Security said the goal is to process immigration cases quickly, so migrant families are not in custody for extended periods. But Oregon Senator Jeff Merkley doesn't think that will be possible.
There is about a 6-year backlog, and so children and parents could be locked up for years.
Legal challenges are expected, and Senator Merkley believes the courts will stop the new rule.
This is completely unacceptable. This is un-American. We are not going to allow the establishment of internment camps.
The change is scheduled to take effect in about 60 days unless the courts put it on hold. In Washington, Alexandra Limon.
Security just announced that it is ending a decades-long federal court agreement that limits how long immigrant children can be kept in detention centers.
Faven Kay joins us from the update desk with more on the changes being made. Faven.
Good morning, guys. The Department of Homeland Security will now use a new immigration rule that would allow it to detain immigrant families who cross the border illegally indefinitely, replacing the long-standing Flores settlement that barred such detentions to 20 days. Now, DHS says it will now hold families together and, quote, improve the integrity of the immigration system, and they've laid out a blueprint for how they'll revise the current minimum standards of care. They say the so-called family centers will be campus-like settings, complete with suites for each family, large community living rooms with big screen TVs, gaming centers, a library, soccer field, movie theater, volleyball court, and they also said that children will now go to school there 5 days a week, painting a far different picture than the detention centers that have been under scrutiny for providing inhumane conditions.
The new rule establishes a high national standard for care of children and families in custody, allows the government to keep families together for fair and expeditious immigration proceedings, restores integrity to our immigration system, and eliminates the incentive for children to be used or exploited to enter the United States.
Yeah, critics, however, say that acting Homeland Security Kevin McClellan's emphasis on the upgrades being made to conditions at detention centers is simply a tactic to divert attention away from the fact that this new immigration policy will essentially allow the DHS to detain undocumented migrant children and families indefinitely. But he says he expects families to remain in custody for an average of 50 days. Now, this new immigration rule goes into effect in 2 months. However, the new rule must be approved by a federal judge and is expected to face an immediate court challenge. Guys, you know this isn't the last that we'll be hearing of this. We'll be sure to bring you any updates as they come into the Fox 5 newsroom. For now, that's the latest at the update desk. Alyssa, let me send things back over to you.
Welcome back. Today, the Trump administration set to release a new rule that would extend the amount of time migrant families would be detained.
So what does this mean for our already overcrowded facilities? Here with reaction is President of the National Border Patrol Council, Brandon Judd. Thank you for being here. You were on late night with Shannon last night, so we appreciate you waking up this morning. Let's take a look at this breakdown of the Flores Settlement Agreement. And this requires minors to be held in facilities must meet certain standards. It prevents children from being held longer than 20 days, mandates the
government favor release to parents, guardians, of course. That's a couple of those things there to note. So with what we're expecting to hear today, how do you think this is going to change? Is this going to be the answer?
Yes, the main driver that fuels illegal immigration into the United States is the catch and release program, or being released once you violate our laws to disappear into the shadows of society. There are a couple facts that nobody can dispute, and one of those facts is that the vast majority of these individuals, once they're released into the United States, never show up to their court appearances, and then we can't deport them at a later date. And so as long as we can hold these individuals pending their asylum claims or their deportation proceedings, illegal immigration will go down to next to none. All we have to do is look back in March of 2017 when we hit 45-year lows. The reason why we hit those 45-year lows is everybody thought that they would be held in detention facilities pending their proceedings, but because we didn't hold those people, illegal immigration skyrocketed. So this would effectively end the catch and release, and that would drive illegal immigration back down to lows that we've never seen before.
How are you expecting critics to attack this latest move, and what's your response?
Well, the critics are going to say that the Flores decision is already ingrained in law. They're going to say that you can't change the Flores decision without a rule, and that's most likely what their lawsuit's going to be. But all you have to do is look at the immigration laws, and it gives the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security vast latitude on how he or she will implement those laws or rules. And this, again, is a rule that allows us to hold those individuals, and it's based upon very sound principles as long as we have detention facilities that gives these children all of the access that they need to health care, food, and including schooling. As long as we do that, then I do believe that the courts will uphold this rule.
We have to get to another topic, but real quick on this one, you don't see this being a problem with the numbers we're seeing right now of migrants crossing the border? You don't see us then just running out of room in these facilities if we're holding them for longer than 20 days?
No, I don't. And the reason is because the word will get back to these countries immediately, and the numbers will drop exponentially. All we have to do is look at the Migrant Protection Protocol. In 3 short months, our apprehensions at the end of this month will be about 100,000 less than what they were in May. And so you can see the immediate effect that we have when we implement proper policies, and this will do the same.
Brandon, in the 30 seconds we have remaining, 3 more states and New York City, as you know, joined the federal lawsuit against the new Trump administration rules that would deny green cards to illegal immigrants if they rely on public assistance. There's the shot on your screen right there of the locales that are doing that. You say lawsuits like these actually help criminal cartels. Why?
They do, because they're able to go into countries and recruit people to come here and violate our laws, and this increases their bottom line. These are illicit businesses, but they're businesses, and they have to make a profit. And so in order to make a profit, they have to recruit people to come here to the United States. These lawsuits, what it does is it sends a clear message that the United States is willing to implement policies like sanctuary city policies where people can, in fact, disappear, and that is, again, one of those other drivers that fuels illegal immigration.
All right, Brandon Judd, just a couple hours of sleep. We thank you for waking up early and joining us. Good information.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for having me.
The crisis on the border now. The Trump administration is looking to remove limits on how long migrant families and children can be detained. It's a proposed new rule that critics say could affect thousands of people. NBC's Craig Boswell reports tonight.
Today, the Trump administration moved to end a 20-day limit on keeping migrant children and families in detention centers. It's a move advocates fear could lead to open-ended detentions, but the head of Homeland Security argues it will actually benefit migrant families.
At the heart of this new rule are 2 core principles: that families should remain together during immigration proceedings, and that conditions for care of children must be appropriate.
The 20-day rule was adopted as a part of a court settlement called the Flores Agreement. It comes as the president is under fire for his treatment of migrant families, especially the children.
Very much I have the children on my mind.
The move outraging immigration advocates.
We have already seen at least 6 children die, thousands of children that have been stripped from their parents' arms. Under these new rules, we know that these conditions are going to just become far worse.
After touring a detention facility in New Jersey today, Democrats vowing to fight what they call the president's latest election year effort to play to his base.
That's un-American, that's unconscionable.
That's unacceptable, and we're going to make sure that we do everything in our power to change it.
Meanwhile, the number of families and children apprehended at the border continues to spike, more than 430,000 so far this year. Craig Boswell, NBC News, Washington.
The proposed rule is scheduled to go into effect in about 60 days, but legal challenges could delay its implementation.
Breaking this hour, a Fox News exclusive as we are obtaining a letter to President Trump and Congress from a top government watchdog that claims the Customs and Border Protection Agency has been failing to collect DNA samples from detained migrants for nearly a decade, and that this, quote, disturbing violation of federal law has allowed violent criminals to walk free. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge is live at the Justice Department with more on this story. Catherine.
Thanks, Melissa, and good afternoon. In the 7-page letter to the president obtained by Fox News, the Office of Special Counsel said Customs and Border Protection had failed to follow federal law, compromise public safety, and let violent offenders walk free. The letter also sent to congressional oversight committees contains the strongest possible language rebuking the department for also defending its actions over the last decade. It reads in part, quote, the agency's noncompliance with the law has allowed subjects subsequently accused of violent crimes, including homicide and sexual assault, to elude detection even when detained multiple times by Customs and Border Protection. This is an unacceptable dereliction of the agency's law enforcement mandate. Fox News first profiled the whistleblowers behind this complaint last month. Under the law, CBP was required to collect DNA from individuals in its custody to be run against FBI violent crimes databases so that they can confirm if the migrants are connected to open sexual assault and murder cases, among others. This program is separate and distinct from DNA collection designed to establish family connections among migrants. This DNA screening for violent offenders was put on hold by the Obama administration in around 2009. Then Secretary Napolitano said the department had resource issues, and then Attorney General Eric Holder agreed. But special counsel investigators have sided with the whistleblowers that this exception was never meant to be permanent, especially not for a decade.
We have a great tool that was mandated by and approved by Congress as a law, and we're not using it.
U.S. citizens, lawful permanent residents, and illegal aliens in this country are and have been harmed due to our agency not collecting DNA.
Earlier today, we asked Acting Secretary McAleenan for comment, but he declined, citing a very tight schedule. We're reaching out for additional comment from CBP. The Office of Special Counsel wants DHS to immediately begin implementing this DNA screening for violent offenders that should have began, and this is important, a decade ago under the last administration, Melissa.
Wow, that is quite a story. Catherine Herridge, thank you for reporting that. We will look forward to
71 degrees. D.C.'s mayor is fighting back against federal plans to build a shelter for migrant children in Northwest. Mayor Bowser issued emergency legislation last night, nipping those plans in the bud. Michael Quander is live where that shelter would be built in Tacoma Park. So, Michael, what does the legislation say?
Yeah, Reese, I got to tell you, we've been on the phone with several sources over the last few days, and they've been able to tell us that this is the spot where a federal contractor is hoping to open that shelter. It's a 4-story building located right on the corner of Laurel Street and Eastern Avenue here in Northwest D.C. Now, the feds say that they need this shelter in order to house migrant children who are coming over by themselves and to also help ease some of the conditions down at shelters on the border. But I got to tell you, some city leaders here say, nah, it's not happening.
What we don't want to happen is for these kids to come and be warehoused.
Immigration advocates are not feeling a plan from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to open a shelter for more than 200 migrant children in the nation's capital.
What the government should be doing is expediting the reunification of those children with their families.
Council members and Mayor Muriel Bowser are on the same page. You see, it's up to the D.C. government to approve the shelter's license. So Mayor Bowser slapped down emergency emergency regulations to block that from happening. The rules temporarily banned the city's child welfare agency from issuing licenses to facilities housing more than 15 people. Those opposing the shelter have pushed for the proposed landlord, Douglas Development, to drop out of the deal. Their fear is that creating more space will give the government freedom to hold more of these children for longer periods of time.
Integrate them overall into the society so that they can have a better life.
That emergency legislation will expire in December. Now, if lawmakers want to make this permanent, they will have to go through the full legislative process. Reese, back to you.
All right, thank you very much.
These members of Congress went behind bars. They toured the Elizabeth Detention Center, housing nearly 300 immigration detainees, about 270 men and 30 women, an announced visit.
It's not my favorite way of going to these places. I would like to do a spot check.
A spot check to determine if this facility had egregious violations of detention standards, as an audit found in 2 other centers holding immigrants. The congressman described the food here as problematic, but aside from that, they declined to talk about the overall conditions because they said the facility knew 3 to 4 weeks in advance that they were coming, and anything that could have been seen as an issue could have been cleared up.
We walked through almost every piece of it.
But they focused on the detainees from Central and South America, Cuba, India, Africa, and even the former Soviet bloc, men and women seeking political asylum.
And what we found was just about each and every one of them voluntarily gave up themselves at the border.
What they've encountered is an overburdened immigration system. It operates under the Justice Department, not the judicial branch of government, where it would be independent of the Trump administration. Some judges are handling 5,000 cases. Each must complete 700 cases or risk losing his or her job.
But speeding up the process really places the judge in a very untenable position of having to uphold his or her oath of office while being worried about whether they're meeting quotas and deadlines.
The congressman said the backlog denies justice to asylum seekers.
We have to stop the Trump administration from changing the law by regulation, by rule, or just by pressure, from preventing people from coming here who are being persecuted. That is not right. That is un-American. And you know, the ICE authorities kept saying, well, the law hasn't changed. Well, maybe the statutory law hasn't changed, but they're Trump is appointing, administration is appointing the immigration judges. They're issuing all kinds of executive orders and policy decisions, in my opinion, that are making it virtually impossible for people to seek political asylum.
Protesters demanded the lawmakers advocate to close down the detention center.
My heart is broken for the people whose lives we've destroyed in their own countries, who have come here to ask us for help, and instead we have put them in jail.
Today, the Trump administration said it was lifting the nearly 2-decade-old court limit on how long it can detain migrant families, from 20 days now to no limits.
This single ruling has substantially caused and continued to fuel the current family unit crisis and the unprecedented flow of Central American families and minors illegally crossing our border.